We would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that this podcast was recorded on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to elders past and present. First, a warning. This episode contains descriptions of medical gaslighting and medical trauma. Listener discretion is advised.
He actually told me, I don't think you're experiencing the pain that you're presenting.
They were telling me, like, you need to calm down. You're being out of control. And I was like, you don't understand the pain I'm in.
And I'll never forget this. He looked me straight in the eyes and he said, "You're female, get used to it."
If you're a woman and you've ever felt dismissed or not believed by a doctor, you might need to hear that no, it's not all in your head. 2 out of 3 women say they've experienced this treatment or felt stereotyped as dramatic or hysterical when seeking healthcare in Australia.
I physically couldn't get out of bed. I would stand up in pain and I would faint because my hips just hurt so bad. And I went into the office and told them, and they're like, well, you're depressed. Do you need anxiety medication? Do you need antidepressants?
The idea of hysteria in women lingers throughout all medical practice in all countries to this day.
When enough people tell you maybe what you're experiencing is not real, you begin to doubt your own perceptions.
This has happened to me too. I'm Grace Jennings-Edquist and I'm a health journalist and author, and I'm your host for this new series, Beyond Hysterical. Over the next few episodes, I'll share with you glimpses of my own experience and the stories of others with first-hand experience of gender bias in healthcare, aka medical misogyny. Because while Australia's healthcare system is in many ways excellent, there's a glaring woman-shaped gap in the system. It's a system that was originally made by men for men, and that gender bias still casts a shadow over medicine today. I'll be speaking to researchers, advocates and policymakers to explain how we got here, what needs to change, and why making those changes has taken so very long. The idea? To tackle medical misogyny, 1 episode at a time.
They told us, sweetheart, it's all in your head. Just a womb on the move, the man once said. Time moved on, but a shadow remained. Our pain ignored, she's emotional again. Brushed off, blamed, in creeps self-doubt.
In 2024, the Australian government ran a survey to find out just how widespread medical misogyny really is today. The results were shocking. Not only did the survey find that 2 in 3 women, or people assigned female at birth, had experienced gender bias or discrimination in healthcare, but it found this bias impacted their lives in really far-reaching ways. Dr. Ramya Raman is a Perth-based specialist GP with a passion for women's health. She's also a member of the National Women's Health Advisory Council, which ran that End Gender Bias survey, as well as being Vice President of the Royal Australian College of GPs. Dr. Raman said the survey results highlighted issues across almost every area of the healthcare system.
So the End Gender Bias survey highlighted that gender bias in itself, and specifically in healthcare, is quite real and it's widespread. And it's undermining the quality and safety of care specifically for women, and women coming from culturally diverse populations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, as well as women coming from vulnerable backgrounds for various reasons. The key is gender bias doesn't just affect patient experience. Ultimately, it actually affects the diagnosis, treatment, and the long-term health outcomes for a patient at an individual level.
That government survey also found that many women had felt dehumanised or even coerced to accept treatment. And these disturbing experiences don't only affect cisgender women, of course. Gender diverse and trans people are also often dismissed when they report pain and symptoms, and one study found half of these patients were hesitant to visit a doctor because of discrimination. All of this is holding our healthcare system back.
We actually have a really world-class healthcare system in many respects, and I'm proud to be a GP in Australia. But I guess despite all of this, it probably comes back to that initial point that gender bias is perhaps a blind spot that still exists. It's like the crack in the foundation. It's quite subtle at first, but ultimately it can have a significant impact because it actually impacts the foundation and undermining trust, safety, and effectiveness.
Now, this podcast isn't just a job for me. It's personal because exactly 4 years ago, I became one of those statistics myself. It was July 2021, and I was pregnant with my second child when I suddenly developed some really awful pelvic pain. So I saw a doctor. And I remember saying, I can barely sit down, I can't sleep. Surely there's something going on here. The doctor basically just didn't seem that concerned. They said I had an overactive pelvic floor, and their advice was basically buy some expensive support shorts and go see a physio and learn some relaxation techniques because stress can really impact pain. I left that appointment feeling totally dismissed and with a diagnosis that didn't feel right, because it wasn't. The real issue was that I had a big infected abscess growing in my pelvis. I found that out when I saw another doctor for a second opinion. The infected growth was bigger than a golf ball and it was threatening to burst, so I needed emergency surgery to remove it. Since then, I've needed about 15 more surgeries and more than 20 hospital admissions. Because, as I found out several doctors later, I have an autoimmune condition called Crohn's disease, and it's one that I'll be managing for the rest of my life. I've seen more than 10 specialists spread across 6 hospitals over the last 4 years, and all of this has been incredibly challenging. Not just the disease itself, but the fact that through becoming chronically ill, I've had a front row seat to gender bias in medicine. I've lived through the gaslighting, the misdiagnosis, the doctors who seem to have no idea how to treat a patient who is pregnant or breastfeeding half the time. I've lived through the trauma of a medical system that wasn't built to know how to treat women's bodies. My body. But there was one thing that helped. I started hearing how I wasn't alone. I was diagnosed around the same time this issue started to hit the mainstream. And I started reading stories about high-profile women who'd experienced the same thing.
Selma Blair has a message for the world. For years, her illness was a mystery. The 46-year-old suffering troubling symptoms. She says doctors didn't take her seriously.
That's right. So Gabrielle Union says for years, people blamed her fertility issues on things like her career or her age. But after 20 years, she says it seems she finally has an answer.
Williams recently told Vogue magazine how she self-diagnosed a life-threatening emergency after giving birth. The nurse thought her pain medicine might be making her confused.
Now, and this morning, Bindi Irwin shared her private health battle. From her hospital bed, Bindi revealed she's been suffering from endometriosis. She wrote, "For 10 years, I've struggled with insurmountable fatigue, pain and nausea."
Once I returned to work after maternity leave, in my day job as a journalist, I started writing about women's stories of misdiagnosis and chronic pain. In the few years that followed, Australia's federal government promised a bigger focus on medical misogyny.
The federal government this week announcing it will form a National Women's Health Advisory Council to examine the healthcare offered to women for menstruation, as well as medical consent and pain management.
And the state of Victoria followed suit.
We've all heard of the gender pay gap. Today we're talking about the gender pain gap.
Then, in 2025, Anthony Albanese's Labor government rode to victory again after promising to make healthcare more accessible to women.
What's in the budget for women? $793 billion over 5 years will be going specifically to women's health.
Australian women will save hundreds of dollars on the cost of popular contraceptive and menopausal treatments, with new education, training and screening facilities also on the way.
So suddenly, medical misogyny is having a moment. A long overdue national conversation has begun, and it can feel like every woman or gender diverse person I talk to has a story of their own. It's like the Me Too movement for healthcare. And all of this talk is a start, a really important start, but it needs to lead to change, to evidence-based solutions. And that's why I made this podcast. Today, though, before we fast forward to those solutions and the reckoning advocates are now working to bring about in modern day Australia, we're going back to the very start. Because to explore what needs to change now, we need to understand the roots of medical misogyny. And we're going to start with the old idea of hysteria in women. It's a notion that first emerged thousands of years ago, and it's one of the best known and most influential examples of how the medical system was built by men and for men.
When traditional practitioners of medicine and doctors and scientists thought about the human being, they thought about men. And that is what they studied. That is what they thought was the normal human experience. And that is all they knew about.
This is Gabrielle Jackson. She's deputy editor at The Guardian Australia, and she's the author of the best-selling book, Pain and Prejudice, from 2019, which explains why our healthcare system is so biased. Despite the fact our healthcare system is excellent in many ways, there are glaring knowledge gaps around gender, sex, and female bodies in medicine, and around the conditions most often seen in those bodies. So, in lieu of actual knowledge, a pretty sexist narrative was subbed in. Namely, that we're just a bit hysterical.
So the word hyster is uterus in Greek. And so it became an official diagnosis for many, many years that women were hysterical. So that's the diagnosis until 1980. It's not that long ago.
In ancient Greece, some writers, including Plato, believed that the womb was capable of movement inside the body, causing serious medical problems. Imagine an animal within an animal, a thirsty creature dragging itself in search of water, pushing aside everything that was on its way. That was how the womb was imagined to behave in the past.
Around the 18th century, hysteria became widely recognised as a disease by Western doctors. And then, as Gabrielle Jackson writes in her book, about a century ago, doctors started to treat women's hormones as the cause of this so-called hysteria.
All humans have fluctuating hormones, by the way, not just women. It's just that they didn't really study women, so they don't understand them as well as they understand the fluctuations in typically male hormones.
In the late 1800s or so, Freud jumped on the hysteria trend too. He said hysteria was all in the mind, caused by unconscious emotional conflict, and this idea caught on and was popular for ages. Here's Gabrielle Jackson again.
While the diagnosis of hysteria has disappeared from the DSM, it still hasn't actually disappeared from medical parlance in all countries of the world. I think it's not typical to go to the doctor and be called hysterical in Australia, but when we did an investigation into endometriosis for The Guardian in 2015, we put a call out on our website, and The Guardian has editions in Europe, the UK and the US, so we got many women, not just one or two. Many of the people who responded to our call out had been told by doctors that they were hysterical. Lots of assumptions about diseases that most commonly affect women and are therefore understudied come from this idea that can't disappear from medicine, that women are inherently unstable emotionally and their emotions affect their physical health.
Now, this podcast is not trying to say that all doctors are sexist. Of course they're not. And of course there's no actual conspiracy in a secret boardroom somewhere among doctors where they all agree to disbelieve women. I also want to acknowledge that, of course, medical science is life-saving and there is so much about our healthcare system I'm grateful for. But it's true also that this healthcare system was built mainly with men in mind. And so it's overdue for an update. And that includes changing what doctors today are still taught and not taught.
I really don't think that most universities are teaching and training hospitals are teaching students to deal with the grey areas of medicine. And there's still a real lack of understanding among doctors that the reason they have all these women with these symptoms they don't understand is because they've never studied women and they've never studied those specific diseases that they're coming in complaining about.
Research published in 2024 found that there is no fixed or explicit requirement to include women's health in Australian medical school curricula, if you can believe that. And that same study out of James Cook University also found that clinical medicine textbooks do not account for sex and gender differences on the whole. So when a woman keeps coming back to the doctor with symptoms that can't be explained, the doctor might not understand why that is, and that's when the old hysteria narrative can creep in. Here's Jackson again.
How it manifests itself is that a woman might go to the doctor and he tries everything he knows to fix her, and then if he thinks he's done everything and there's still nothing he can find, often doctors are women, of course I'm using he because that's traditionally where these ideas came from, then that's when the blame starts coming in. Oh, you've delayed pregnancy. Have you had children? How many children have you had? Are you a good wife and mother in, inverted commas? And if they aren't, that's when this idea that it must be something you're doing. If I can't fix you and I've tried everything I know, then it must be something that's wrong with you.
And it's not just womb-adjacent conditions receiving this kind of response either. So women with symptoms of heart disease, for example, are twice as likely to be diagnosed with mental illness compared to men with identical symptoms. And there are plenty of other conditions affected by this bias as well. So when the Australian government ran its End Gender Bias survey in 2024, it found that women were most often dismissed by doctors when they sought help for sexual and reproductive health issues, mental health issues, chronic fatigue and chronic pain. That survey found that women's pain was often put down to other causes, things like periods, lifestyle factors, or even just faking it. As sad as that sounds, it really does check out, because other studies show that doctors do take women's pain less seriously than men's, and that doctors are less likely to prescribe women powerful painkillers even when they need them. And when racial bias enters the mix, patients are taken even less seriously. So when a black woman complains of pain, she's more likely than a white woman to have her pain dismissed or trivialised, and she's less likely to receive pain medication. Back to Gabrielle Jackson.
There are still some specific diagnoses that lend themselves to the idea of hysteria. I think fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME, often people with those diagnoses are kind of considered hysterical in many ways. Medically unexplained symptoms, which is not used as much in Australia but is very prevalent in the UK and other places. That's basically code for hysteria. And the really distressing thing about those kinds of diagnoses, even though fibromyalgia and ME/CFS are proven illnesses that have been shown and have specific causes, symptoms, and really debilitating symptoms, a lot of patients are still written off as crazy or hysterical once they have those diagnoses. So, hysteria lives on in many, many ways, and it really manifests in diseases that are understudied and under-recognised.
Conditions that are experienced by more women than men, which includes things like anxiety, endometriosis or migraines, generally just haven't been as well funded or as well studied as other diseases. And as a result, these so-called women's conditions are often less understood. Women's pain, in particular, hasn't been well studied enough. So here's one not-so-fun fact. 70% of people with chronic pain are women, but about 80% of pain research has been done on men or on male mice. So the gender healthcare gap is a wide-reaching cycle, from hospitals to libraries to labs, schools and governments, and back again. Now, I mentioned before how women have historically been left out of experiments. Here's what Dr. Ramya Raman has to say about why that happened.
It's a combination of factors that are contributing towards this. I think initially researchers were concerned about the potential risks of women during their fertility or their fertile period or during pregnancy and the hormonal variations that were being seen. And they felt that perhaps that was like a complicating factor for data analysis. But underlying to this was probably also a very strong element of bias, the default assumption that the men's physiology is probably the standard and women were perhaps a deviation from that, and not aligning science, numbers and data collection to that is a blind spot in itself, as you can understand.
Basically, it was all a bit too hard. Better to just tailor it to blokes and hope it works out well for the rest of the population too. The problem is that sometimes it doesn't. Back to Gabrielle Jackson.
It's so bizarre to me when I think about it, because on the one hand they said humans are men and women are men with wombs, basically. And on the other hand, they said we can't study women because so much about them is weird with all these fluctuating hormones that it would just mess with our results. So which is it? Are we men with wombs and you don't need to study? Or are we so different that you can't study us, in which case you should study us because you need to know what's happening with all those weird fluctuating hormones?
And the issue with not studying women's bodies enough is not just about treatment and making sure medicines are safe for all patients. The issue is also about needing to understand sex-specific symptoms too, because some conditions do show up differently in women.
That's just physiology. So mentally, physically, biologically, men and women are simply not built the same way. So what we do know is that being female puts us and I say us, me being female myself, at a higher risk of some of the most challenging conditions. So examples include autoimmune conditions, which tend to affect about 8% of the global population, but 78% of those affected are women. And females are 3 times more likely than males to develop rheumatoid arthritis and 4 times more likely to have the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune condition that tends to affect the central nervous system.
Speaking of autoimmune diseases, the impact on how some of those conditions show up in the body still isn't fully understood. So take my own disease, Crohn's. Researchers do know that fluctuating hormones from pregnancy and periods, for example, can impact the disease activity. And in my case, Crohn's actually developed for the first time during a pregnancy, obviously a big hormonal time. But studies on the effects of these big hormonal shifts on Crohn's patients are still pretty limited. So I guess I'll just find out myself in about 10 to 15 years how menopause impacts the whole disease. Talk about something to look forward to. Here's Dr. Raman again on why we need to pay attention to the ways some conditions present differently in women.
So women also make up 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's disease and 3 times more likely to have a heart attack more than men. So speaking of heart disease is really common. It's really common in Australia. And on average, women are diagnosed with heart disease 7 to 10 years later than men. It's another example where sex or perhaps sexism still plays a huge determining factor. Women are less likely to experience the classic symptoms of a heart attack, you know, the chest pain, the central crushing sort of chest pain. Women tend to have a combination of symptoms that are a little bit difficult, more like jaw pain, a little bit of pain going down their arm, perhaps some breathlessness, so shortness of breath, vomiting. These seem to be the more common symptoms rather than the central crushing chest pain. And maybe this hasn't come out in light as much and in our teachings because initially, back in the day, a lot of the data that was collected were from male patients. So the data is skewed in itself.
So none of this paints a rosy picture. But the fact that I'm able to be here with you now, sharing all of this with you and speaking to experts who have actually looked into how to move the dial is a sign of progress. I mean, at least we're talking about it, right?
There's a long way to go, but it's so encouraging how much has changed, and the level of understanding about medical misogyny and medical bias is really a testament to so many people in the media and advocacy groups and politicians willing to listen. It's really encouraging.
In the 6 years since Gabrielle Jackson published her book, or the decade since she first investigated endometriosis with The Guardian Australia, she's watched women's health become far less stigmatised.
I can't even communicate to you how much has changed. Like, I never imagined in a million years that the conversation could change so quickly. You know, my niece is, now starting high school in an environment where everyone knows what endometriosis is. I'd never heard the word until I was 22 years old and was diagnosed with it myself. So just even being able to talk about periods and pain around periods is much easier. But the huge conversation that has been kickstarted in Australia by mainly Australian women is so encouraging.
So Australia is really in its infancy of introducing sex and gender equity into health and medical research, and we lag behind Europe and North America on this front by at least 10 years.
This is Dr. Sue Haupt. She's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Sex and Gender Equity in Health and Medicine at the George Institute for Global Health at UNSW, among other things. Dr. Haupt's research focuses on sex disparities in medical research and health. And I sat down to ask her about why all of this matters and how far Australia still has to go in this space. But first, an important note on terminology.
I think it's probably relevant before I go any further into this that I just make a distinction between the use of the term sex and gender, because we're often using them interchangeably, but actually they're not the same. So sex really refers to our biology, which is largely determined by our sex chromosomes at X and Y, also our hormones, and usually defined by the genitalia at birth. And that's males and females, and there is now also recognition of variation in sex characteristics also occurring. Gender, on the other hand, is how we identify ourselves. The way we identify ourselves or the way society labels us, generally by our behaviours, and they're the terms women, men and gender diverse people.
Thank you, Dr. Haupt, for that distinction. That's really important, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Can you please talk us through when the public conversation we're having now around medical misogyny first started to emerge in Australia and perhaps elsewhere in the West?
So in a nutshell, attention to sex and gender equity in health and medicine is usually pinpointed back to the 1960s when the drug thalidomide tragically led to babies being born with misformed limbs. And counterintuitively, instead of then finding a way to properly test drugs in females so that treatments could be used safely, women were essentially excluded from clinical trials for decades until they found their voice in around the 1980s, and their lobbying led to the beginning of awareness.
Then 1993 was a bit of a landmark year. That's when the US passed a law that made it illegal not to include women in federally funded clinical trials. In Australia, also in 1993, the National Health and Medical Research Council, or the NHMRC, came up with a plan to encourage women's inclusion in trials. And just last year, so this is August 2024, the NHMRC released a statement advocating for sex and gender to be routinely considered in health and medical research. And Dr. Haupt says that was a really important step. But to this day in Australia, it's actually still not illegal not to include women in clinical trials, although it is increasingly discouraged and seen as unethical.
Australia's had a very slow start. And we really welcome the recognition of NHMRC's statement in 2024, setting these new standards. But we still have a long way to go to actually integrate that into practice. Notably, still women are underrepresented in phase 1 clinical trials. They're the dose testing and side effects testing. And also testing of medical devices, so where levels of inclusions are still only around 30%, which is pretty significant.
We still have a lot of catching up to do.
In North America, they started a society for gender sex-specific medicine. That was around 25 years ago, and that was really triggered by pioneering recognition of different heart attack symptoms between the sexes.
Next, Europe and Canada set up similar organisations.
And the Canadian experience, which is at least 10 years ahead of us, makes us realise that it's not just enough to come out with a statement. We actually really need to start training and teaching and properly integrate those ideas before it can get to the next level, which is actually patient benefit.
Gabrielle Jackson has something to add here.
I think the Australian government is still funding research that only studies male animals. I can't understand how that's still a thing. The US changed that in 2016. We're 10 years later and we're still funding single-sex preclinical studies in only male animals.
And just to be super clear on why that matters, here's Dr. Haupt again.
If we don't recognise that female and male bodies influence our health and disease and remain stuck with that classic one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare, we actually end up with one size not adequately fitting anybody, and that's suboptimal. So this can occur by not properly including females in trials or not breaking down the data to see whether males and females respond differently to a treatment. And a well-known example of that is 8 out of 10 drugs that were pulled from the American market between 1997 and 2000, and they were pulled because they had a greater health risk to women. And each drug has an estimated cost of $1.6 billion to develop. So it's just simply an astronomical waste of money that could have been avoided.
There are other examples of drugs tested on men that can't be generalised to women too. One study into recovery times from general anaesthesia found that women woke up from anaesthesia almost twice as fast as men. And keep in mind that women typically have a higher percentage of body fat, so they metabolise certain drugs faster. And researchers would know a whole lot more about this kind of stuff if they, studied women more often. To what extent, Dr. Haupt, do you think this issue is having a moment, and when do you think it sort of started to become more of a hot button issue, if so?
There is definitely a heightened awareness around sex and gender equity in health and medicine in Australia right now, and with a new interest in actually tailoring care to meet women's health needs, but also men's and other people who don't fit those binary definitions. It's definitely an area that's, I think, on the crest of a wave of interest. These discussions are crucial to raising awareness and stimulating changes in thought and then practice. I think the topic deserves to stay in the spotlight until there's no longer a need to call out health inequities, basically. I just think it's a troubling reflection on our Western democracies that although women make up around 51% of the vote, priorities have been so skewed away from us that men were sent to the moon before women on Earth even received proper medical attention. It's kind of a damning condemnation, I think, of our system.
The thing we haven't touched on yet is the cost and the human toll of misdiagnosis and treatment being delayed.
The cost is high, both personally as well as systemically. So women reported years of delay before receiving diagnosis for certain conditions. And the examples that sort of spring to mind are women's health conditions like endometriosis or autoimmune conditions or neurodiverse conditions like ADHD. So these sorts of delays led to worsening symptoms, which has affected and can affect mental health and mental health deterioration, and ultimately leading to lost productivity. And lost productivity is not about money. It's about the functionality of a person within society as well. The ultimate risk, of course, is that medical misogyny could actually kill you. And this does happen sometimes. It can be fatal. But there are many other instances where diagnoses are missed and delayed, meaning that the disease progresses unchecked.
And we sat in the doctor's office and she didn't actually say, "You have cancer." She just looked at me and she just said, "You know what I'm going to say." And I just looked at this GP with probably, the evilest smile on my face. And I just said, "Told you so."
This is Dr. Alexandra Dunn. She's a researcher living on the Gold Coast, and she's no stranger to the medical system. She's had endometriosis for decades. Alex is also one of countless women in Australia whose symptoms and pain have been missed or misdiagnosed.
For about 2 years, it felt like I had metal bands wrapped around my chest. And every year they would get tighter and tighter. And I told doctors about this. And they just put it down to period pain, because once you have a label or a diagnosis or a box to be shoved in, that's it. That's all you are. You are just endometriosis and nothing else. And I now realise that was the tumour growing and impacting my organs and my breathing even.
About 5 years ago, she was diagnosed with a kidney tumour. But actually finding someone who would take her symptoms seriously was tricky. Alex saw 4 GPs about her pain before the cancer was discovered.
There were times when I would have difficulty breathing and doctors would say, "You're overweight, that's the issue."
Her symptoms came to a head one night. Her pain was out of control. She was urinating bright red blood. She felt like she needed urgent treatment, but she didn't think she'd be taken seriously.
And still, I heard that man's voice in my head. This is a male GP I saw. He said, "If women turn up in emergency with bad period pain, we laugh at them and send them home." And he looked right at me as he said it, and he had a little giggle. And so I'm in bed, screaming in literal agony, more pain than I've ever been in. And still, I didn't call an ambulance and ask for help because of that man.
Now, Alex's usual GP was away, so the next day she took herself to another doctor. And that doctor was really concerned and said it's imperative that you get a kidney scan.
So I waited for my normal GP to come back, and she refused to give me a scan. She said the government are cracking down on us, giving out unnecessary scans for made-up problems, is what she said. So I looked her straight in the eyes and I said, "I come from a long line of drama queens. If you don't give me that scan, I am going to cause a scene." I kept my tone nice and quiet. My smile was probably a little bit evil, but I had had enough. So she printed out the scan, and I kid you not, she threw it at me in dismissal, like, "Get out of my office. I don't want to see you again."
Alex got that CT scan, and not long after, she got a call from her GP's office telling her to come in straight away and to bring a support person. Alex turned up with her mum in tow, and they knew the news wouldn't be good.
And we sat in the doctor's office, and she didn't actually say, "You have cancer." She just looked at me and she just said, "You know what I'm going to say." That's it. That was my diagnosis. Mum's fainting in the corner, and I just looked at this GP with probably, the evilest smile on my face, and I just said, "Told you so." Like, that was my response.
There's got to be a bit of satisfaction in that, though, like after her initial response.
Yes, 100%. I felt vindicated. I really did. Like, to be happy to be told you have cancer is incredible. It really is.
Yeah, well, you had to fight that hard. So what actually was the diagnosis, Alex, and what was the size of what they found?
I was lucky in the end that it was found to be benign. So very lucky. But the size of it was incredible. I think it ended up being 7.5 centimetres outside of the kidney and also all within the kidney too. So more than the size of a grapefruit. You can imagine that.
That is huge. So the pressure and pain that you'd felt was actually the mass growing.
Yes, and then dying. I was just exhausted all the time because it had started to rot. I had necrotic flesh within me, going on 6 months.
Oh my gosh. And so then you had to undergo surgery, obviously, to get rid of that tumour. And then what was the outcome ultimately?
It's called a nephrectomy. They took out the whole kidney, so they go around so as not to damage the tumour because it could pop and spread and make a whole mess of going inside. So they go in and they take the layer of fat that surrounds the whole kidney and the tumour as well. So I had this lovely divot in my body for a while.
Alex is now, thankfully, cancer-free. But here's the really scary thing. Alex's story isn't a one-off.
That's what we face all the time. We get that for a lot of issues with women's health. The world is not kind to you, you're female, get used to it. And unfortunately, we do. We do. We take it on the chin and we just get on with our work and our life and deal with the pain and suffering. Sort of like the baggage we carry around.
And there's the invisible unpaid work that goes into advocating for yourself in a medical system that doesn't always listen as well. I asked Alex about this because she's lived it herself. Alex, throughout the process of pushing repeatedly for a diagnosis, did you have times when you felt awkward or like you were sort of second-guessing yourself or wondering if you were being too pushy? And did that ever stop you from sort of seeking help or seeking a second opinion at all?
I felt lost and that no one was listening to me. But I have been a fighter since I was 6. I've been a defender of the downtrodden. If there was bullies at school bullying my sisters, I would jump in and stop it because it was wrong. And the right thing to do was to protect people. So I had no trouble standing up for myself. I never have. I grew up with a saying in my family, walk tall and carry a big stick. And I loved that. But being a gardener, I'll change that to a shovel. So I do walk tall and act confident. Even when I don't feel it, even when I'm shaking inside, I will still present a face of confidence because people will respect you and actually listen to you. So the only way that you have is to stick up for yourself because nobody else is going to save you, unfortunately.
That's really good advice. Thank you. And by the way, I do want to let listeners know next episode we'll be digging more into practical advice for self-advocacy for patients too. Alex, I want to ask, what do you think is helping to change the conversation, if anything? Or what needs to happen now to help move the dial?
The petty side of me would like for men to suffer period pain just once, because I believe if they did, there would be a lot of money poured into women's health issues. This year, I was on the wait list for my second endometriosis clean-out, let's call it, where they laparoscopically go in and use a soldering iron on all your internal organs. But I was on the wait list for ages, for years, until Anthony Albanese, our Prime Minister, came out and said, we take women's health seriously. 2 days later, I got a phone call from the hospital saying I was being put into the private and I would be operated on ASAP. So it does prove that if governments step in and say women's health needs to be treated seriously, it is, for a little while at least.
Do you think that this discussion around gender bias in medicine is finally having its moment? And if so, does that make you feel encouraged?
I am normally an optimist and I like to have hope for things like this, and I do have hope. But history has proven that Time and again, we have these panels and we have experts talking about what needs to change, and nothing comes from it. Enough panels, we have enough research, we have enough investigations, we have enough women speaking out about being misdiagnosed and suffering for years. That's enough. Enough is enough, really. We can't keep talking about it. We need action.
And Dr. Raman couldn't agree more.
We've come a long way, but we certainly have a longer way to go. So we have to continue working in that space to make sure that the gaps on how diseases present and progress in women is different, and we need to address that appropriately. In the field of medical science or research, and women's health often is thought about as a niche area, but in fact it shouldn't be. It should just be part and parcel of what medicine actually evolves to be. It's not actually like a niche area. Any doctor should be able to actually deal and manage with that.
I'm Grace Jennings-Edquist. Thank you for joining me for episode 1 of Beyond Hysterical, and special thanks to our guests today, Gabrielle Jackson, Dr. Sue Haupt, Dr. Ramya Raman and Dr. Alex Dunn. Next episode, we look at 9 tried and tested individual tactics to help women and gender diverse people navigate a system that wasn't made for them. We'll look at knowing your patient rights, learning how and when to ask for a second opinion, and 7 other tips. Beyond Hysterical is created and hosted by me, Grace Jennings-Edquist, and I'm also the executive producer. Sally Spicer is our senior producer, and Michael Joyner is our audio editor. Don't forget to follow the show on Instagram at Beyond Hysterical. Beyond Hysterical shares the opinions of individuals and provides information for educational purposes only. It should not be relied upon for health or medical advice and is not a substitute for professional health advice.
Brushed off, blamed, in creeps self-doubt. Still told to breathe instead of shout. Girl, the system wasn't built for us, but for men, why you making a fuss? Enough. If listening to women is seen as radical, then doc, come on, let's move on from hysterical.